Off from the Wilder. There was one night it got to be 536, and I said, I want you to do the wacky scene. Where we really go crazy for years, one of comedy's most iconic figures stayed quiet about something that fans, insiders, and even close friends wondered about. At 99 years old, Mel Brooks is breaking that silence, and what he's revealing about Gene Wilder has stirred emotion, laughter, and reflection across generations. Why wait this long? What kept him quiet all these years was a grief. Was it guilt? Or was there something too personal, too sacred to say until now? What we're about to uncover isn't gossip, it's legacy. Backed by late-night interviews, real tears, and years of rumors, we're diving into a bond that shaped the golden age of comedy, and why it remained hidden in silence until the very end, when two geniuses collided. It wasn't just chemistry, it was combustion. When Mel Brooks and Gene Wilder first crossed paths, it marked the birth of one of Hollywood's most electrifying creative duos. Both were geniuses in their own right, but when their worlds collided, something rare happened. They didn't just work together, they transformed comedy itself. Their first encounter was unassuming. Mel Brooks was visiting the set of Mother Courage, a play in which his wife and Bancroft starred. Wilder was there too, playing the chaplain, a role steeped in both tragedy and dark humor. He was touching, he was funny, and I saw right away. This guy wasn't just an actor. He had soul. Brooks would later say, that moment wasn't destiny yet, but it was the spark. It wasn't long before that spark turned into a flame. Mel Brooks was struggling to get a film made, something audacious, something that nobody wanted to fund. The working title, The Producers. When Brooks finally landed the money, he kept his promise to Wilder. "You're Leo Bloom," he told him, tossing the script onto his makeup table. And in that dressing room, Gene Wilder burst into tears. From that moment forward, they were more than collaborators. They were partners in mischief. He blessed every film we did with his magic. Brooks said, through tears during a rare interview, and he blessed me with his friendship. Their connection wasn't just based on laughs, it was emotional, intellectual, and deeply personal. Wilder didn't just perform a role, he felt it, dissected it, and reinvented it, sometimes pushing Brooks himself out of his comfort zone. Young Frankenstein, for example. Wilder co-wrote it with Brooks, and he famously fought to include the now legendary put-in on the Ritz tap dance scene, something Brooks initially dismissed as frivolous. But Gene wouldn't let it go. He argued so hard he turned blue until finally Brooks gave in the result. One of the most iconic scenes in comedy history. "I wasn't sure it was right," Brooks later admitted, "but if he fought for it like that, I knew it had to be." Their dynamic worked because it was built on trust and tension. Mel was the loud New York provocateur, a man with no filter in big vision. Gene was softer, quieter, yet just as daring, especially when it came to nuance and character. They pushed each other, challenged each other, and somehow always landed on the same wavelength. He only had one real fight, Wilder later revealed, and it was over something we both ended up loving together. They gave us The Producers, Blazing Saddles, and Young Frankenstein, three films that redefined genre-risked controversy and somehow won over critics and audiences alike. But the real magic wasn't just in the scripts or the scenes, it was in the unspoken language between two men who trusted each other completely. He was more than a friend. Brooks said he was my brother. But even the strongest collaborations must weather change as their careers evolved. So did the distance between them. Gene began to step away from the spotlight. He became more private. Mel kept making films, but never quite found that same spark again. The silence between them wasn't a feud. It was time aging life, and still fans kept asking, why haven't they worked together again? What happened behind the scenes? Was there a rift that never healed? What if that silence wasn't avoidance at all? What if it was a shield, or something much deeper than the public ever imagined, creating chaos and changing comedy? When Mel Brooks and Gene Wilder joined forces, they didn't just make people laugh. They broke every rule about how comedy was supposed to work. Their partnership wasn't about safe jokes or tidy punchlines. It was about chaos controlled only by genius, and that chaos would go on to reshape the DNA of American comedy forever. Wilder wasn't just another funny man. He had trained for 18 years, studying under dramatic masters, refining his craft with the seriousness of a classical actor. He approached every role, no matter how ridiculous, with deadpan sincerity, and that's exactly what made it so funny. The more real you can make a comedy, the funnier it's going to be. He said, instead of making faces doing funny voices, you believe in it 1,000%. Belief was the secret weapon in the Brooks-Wilder formula. Whether it was Leo Bloom's hysterical meltdowns in The Producers, or Dr. Frankenstein's descent into mad science in Young Frankenstein, Gene always played it straight, and it worked because the world around him was anything but Mel Brooks. On the other hand, thrived in absurdity. He was chaos incarnate together. He created a kind of comedic alchemy that no one had seen before. Take Blazing Saddles. The script was already outrageous, filled with racial satire, fourth wall breaks, and wild tonal shifts. But it was Gene's arrival, taking over a role originally meant for someone else, that grounded the film in humanity. His character, the Waco Kid, was an alcoholic gunfighter with a tremor and a tragic backstory. But somehow you felt for him even as he delivered some of the sharpest punchlines in the film. I saw sadness in him. Mel once said, even when Gene was making you laugh, you knew he understood something deeper. That's what made him irreplaceable. Their projects weren't just comedy films. They were acts of defiance, mocking everything from the Nazis, The Producers, to racism, Blazing Saddles, to science itself. Young Frankenstein studios balked. Critics hesitated, but audiences, they couldn't get enough in a time when most comedies played it safe. Brooks and Wilder dove headfirst into controversy, and always found the humanity in the madness. Even their behind-the-scenes process was unpredictable. Mel would yell out ideas mid-scene. Gene would storm off, set only to come back with a better take. There were moments of friction, creative clashes, that sometimes bordered on fights. But those clashes were always about making the film better, never about ego. Mel made me angry. He made me crazy. But he also made me brave. Gene wrote in his memoir, he pulled things out of me I didn't know I had. That bravery translated to the screen, whether it was Wilder suggesting an old-school musical number with a monster, or Mel pushing censors to their limits. Every creative decision was a gamble, and yet they almost always hit the mark. The films they made together weren't just hits. They were cultural earthquakes, still studied, quoted, and adored to this day. And yet, no matter how chaotic the comedy became, the emotional core remained untouched. That was the Wilder effect. He didn't just want to entertain. He wanted to say something, even if it was hidden under layers of slapstick and satire. I never cared about being funny. He once told an interviewer, I cared about being real, and if that made people laugh, even better. Eventually, the chaos quieted. Gene slowed down. Mel kept writing, but their collaborative era came to an end. Fans wondered, was it burnout, creative differences, or was something more private pulling them apart? Because behind the laughter, something began to shift. And soon it wasn't about what they created. It was about what they lost. Gene's quiet struggles, private pain. Behind Gene Wilder's warm smile and magnetic performances, a storm quietly brewed. His roles may have been whimsical and filled with wonder, but his private life told a much more fragile story, one marked by heartbreak, illness, and emotional withdrawal. The same man who brought laughter to millions was slowly stepping away from the spotlight, not out of fading fame, but out of something far more human. pain. It wasn't sudden. It was gradual, so subtle in fact, that most people didn't even notice it was happening until he was gone. But Mel Brooks did. In interviews years later, Brooks would mention how Gene's once boundless energy began to wane. The phone calls got shorter, the appearances less frequent. He knew something was wrong. Mel confessed he was fading in a way that had nothing to do with show business. Much of that retreat traced back to personal tragedy. In 1989, Gene lost his beloved wife, comedian Gilda Radner, to ovarian cancer. The two had shared an electric, deeply affectionate bond, one that defined Wilder's middle years and lost, shattered his foundation. Friends said he was never quite the same after Gilda's death. He poured his grief into activism, helping launch Gilda's Club, a network of support centers for those fighting cancer. But inside, he withdrew for years. He avoided Hollywood. He turned down scripts, declined interviews. He once said, "I didn't leave acting. I just didn't want to do it anymore." When asked why, his response was telling: it stopped being fun. But was it really about the industry, or was it about preserving what little joy he had left? Mel Brooks never pushed him. "I respected his distance," Brooks later admitted, "but God, I missed him." The two stayed in touch, though, less and less often. Whenever Gene did agree to appear in public on Conan O'Brien's show, or at a rare book event, fans noticed how different he seemed. Softer, quieter, still sharp, still witty, but carrying something behind the eyes, a weight. And that weight would eventually be given a name: Alzheimer's. The diagnosis was kept secret. Wilder chose not to go public with his condition, opting instead for peace and privacy. According to his family, he didn't want the world to mourn him before he was gone. He didn't want pity. Most of all, he didn't want children, those who adored Willy Wonka, to see their hero in decline. His silence was in its own way a final act of grace. But Mel Brooks knew he was sick, and I knew it, Brooks told Jimmy Fallon during a heart-wrenching late-night interview. "I expected that he would go, but when it happens, it's still tremendous. It's a big shock. I'm still reeling from. No more Gene. I can't call him." That admission cracked something open for a man like Mel, so often the loudest, funniest guy in the room to break down on national television. Was startling. But that's what Gene Wilder meant to him. This wasn't just a creative partner. This was family, the kind you lose once in a lifetime and never replace. As Wilder's illness progressed, so too did the silence between them. Not out of bitterness, but inevitability. It's possible Wilder simply wanted Mel to remember him as he had been, vibrant while died, and funny as hell, not weakened, not fading. Just Gene and Mel respected that wish. But that long silence, it started to eat at something: regret maybe, or maybe just the ache of having more to say, and nowhere to say it. Because when Wilder died in 2016, something in Brooks seemed to dim. His tributes were moving but brief. His interviews filled with long pauses. What he wanted to say had been evolving all along, and when he finally did speak, it wasn't what people expected. The call that never came. There's a kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room, it echoes. And for Mel Brooks, that silence came in the form of a missing phone call. After decades of friendship, shared history, laughter, and tears, the end didn't arrive with a goodbye, but with an absence, a dial tone that never clicked over a voice he never heard one last time in 2016 when Gene Wilder died from complications related to Alzheimer's disease. The world paused, news outlets ran retrospectives, fans took to social media. Tributes poured in from celebrities and former stars. But for Mel Brooks, the moment was strangely still, because he hadn't spoken to Gene in months, maybe even years. Not because of a falling out, not because of pride, but because Wilder chose quiet over explanation. He didn't want anyone to see him that way. A family member said later he was afraid it would change how people remembered him. But for Mel, That silence cut deep, not because he didn't understand, but because he didn't get to say goodbye. There had been no warning call, no quiet lunch, no final moment to share old jokes or say things that had been left unsaid for someone like Mel Brooks, who had shared decades of laughter and pain with Gene. The absence of that final conversation left a lingering ache. He spoke about it sparingly in a rare Tonight Show appearance. Shortly after Gene's passing, Brooks was uncharacteristically subdued. I expected that he would go, but when it happens, it's still tremendous. He told Jimmy Fallon, "It's a big shock. I'm still reeling from No More Gene. I can't call him that line. I can't call him wasn't just about grief. It was about unfinished sentences." The shared creative language they had built, the producers, young Frankenstein blazing saddles, suddenly felt like fragments of a larger conversation that would never be completed. And in that void, Mel seemed to wrestle with a haunting question. Why didn't Gene call? But the answer was layered. Gene had always been private. Even his Alzheimer's diagnosis had been shielded from public knowledge until after his death. According to close friends, he didn't want anyone, not even Mel, to witness the full erosion of the wit and sharpness that had defined his identity. It wasn't out of shame but preservation for Wilder. The image mattered not for ego's sake, but for the memories he left behind. Still, that choice came at a cost. Mel Brooks, now well into his 90s, admitted in recent reflections that he sometimes imagines what that final conversation might have been. He wonders if they would have argued about something trivial, like whether young Frankenstein needed more dancing, or whether Gene would have teased him one more time about his noisy directing. He used to say, "Mel, you direct like a trumpet, loud, proud, and sometimes flat." I loved that. Instead, there was just silence. And in that quiet, Mel had to do something he never wanted. Say goodbye without hearing Gene say anything back. "I think about him all the time," he admitted in a more recent interview. "There's so much I wish I could have told him. But maybe he knew it anyway. Maybe we didn't need the words. Maybe not. But that doesn't mean the absence didn't leave a mark, because for someone who made the world laugh louder than most, Mel Brooks found himself struggling with the one thing he never expected. A goodbye that was never spoken, only felt. And yet that wasn't the end of their story. And when he finally told the world what really happened behind the scenes of their decades-long partnership, he didn't hold anything back. The legacy they built together, some creative dues, just work. But Mel Brooks and Gene Wilder weren't simply collaborators. They were a rare force of nature. Their partnership wasn't forged in contracts or career strategy. It was felt. Their films didn't just make people laugh. They carved themselves into the culture, imprinting unforgettable moments that still live decades later. Together, they didn't just create movies. They created moments that became part of the American comedic DNA. Their legacy starts, of course, with the producers. Mel had the idea, the script, the vision. But the role of Leo Bloom needed something special. And Gene brought more than acting chops to the part. He brought vulnerability, neurosis, warmth, and a manic charm that gave the film its soul. The scene where Leo has a meltdown over his blue blanket wasn't just acting. It was the birth of a new kind of comedic rhythm. Mel later said there was no one else who could have been Leo. Gene was Leo. The film went on to win an Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay, and later became a Broadway hit. But even with its wild satire and taboo-pushing jokes, what people remembered was the chemistry. Blazing Saddles took their collaboration to new heights. Wilder wasn't originally cast as the Waco Kid. Gig Young had the role. But when Young collapsed on set from alcohol withdrawal, Mel made a desperate call to Gene. "I need you." He told him Gene showed up the next day, stepped into the part, and stole the film with his dry delivery, soft-spoken sarcasm, and scenes that danced between absurdity and brilliance. Who could forget? "I must have slain more men than Cecil B. DeMille." Then came Young Frankenstein, arguably their crown jewel. This wasn't just another comedy. It was a cinematic love letter to horror classics, infused with soul science and slapstick. Gene co-wrote it with Mel and was fiercely protective of its tone. He insisted on shooting it in black and white. He argued for quiet emotion alongside parody. And the result? A film that's not only funny, but beautiful. It balanced sincerity and lunacy in a way few comedies ever have. Critics adored it. Audiences embraced it, and film schools still study it. The putting on the Ritz number, which Gene fought to include, became iconic. Mel was hesitant. Gene insisted it was absurd. It was risky. It was perfect. Their legacy wasn't about box office numbers. It was about daring to be weird, human, and hilarious all at once. Their work wasn't just smart. It had heart. Mel would say later, Gene made things real. Even the wildest scenes had something grounded because of him. That's why the laughs stuck with you. But perhaps what makes their legacy endure isn't just the content of the films, but the trust behind them. Gene trusted Mel to be bold. Mel trusted Gene to find the soul inside the madness. That mutual belief allowed them to take comedic risks. No one else would dare. Like centering a musical around springtime for Hitler, or mixing slapstick with tragedy. They weren't afraid of going too far because they were grounded by the sincerity of their friendship. They knew when to pull back, when to push harder, when to listen, when to fight. Years later, comedians from Steve Martin to Jordan Peele have cited Mel and Gene's work as influences. Their fingerprints are all over modern comedy, not just in tone or pacing, but in fearlessness. And even though Gene Wilder is gone, that legacy hasn't faded, because what they built together wasn't just a run of hits. It was a body of work that continues to whisper to new generations. You can be smart and silly. You can be outrageous and kind. You can take comedy seriously without ever taking yourself too seriously. But just as they had finally reached the height of their comedic power, a shift began. Something started pulling them in different directions. The reason for that drift. It wasn't career. It was something far more human. Mel's breaking point on tonight's show. For decades, Mel Brooks had been the loudest laugh in any room. A one-man engine of energy, absurdity, and unmatched comedic force. But that image cracked just for a moment on national television. It wasn't scripted, and it wasn't for show. It was real, raw, and absolutely unforgettable. It happened during a 2016 appearance on The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon. The occasion was somber. Gene Wilder had passed away only weeks earlier at the age of 83 following complications from Alzheimer's. For fans, it was a blow. For Mel, it was the loss of a creative soulmate, someone who'd shaped not just his career, but his life. When Fallon asked about Gene, Mel didn't launch into one of his usual wisecracks. He paused, his voice faltered, and then eyes welling. He said, "I expected that he would go, but when it happens, it's still tremendous. It's a big shock. I'm still reeling. No more Gene. I can't call him. He was such a wonderful part of my life." In that moment, the world saw the man behind the madness. Not the comedy icon. Not the filmmaker. Just Mel, the friend. The man who had known Gene since the earliest days when they'd met backstage during a production of Mother Courage. Mel's late wife, Anne Bancroft, had been performing in the show. Gene played the chaplain. It was a small part, but one that sparked something. The role was funny and sad. Mel recalled that was Gene. From that moment on, Gene became more than just an actor Mel admired. He became a fixture in Mel's stories, his dreams, his jokes, and eventually his films. But now, sitting across from Fallon, Mel's memories had turned into grief, and there was no punchline that could undo that. What made the Tonight Show moment so devastating wasn't just the tears. It was what Mel chose to share next. He told the story of how the producers came to life, of how he promised Gene the role of Leo Bloom before even having the money to make the film. And I said, "Look, I'm promising you when we get the money, you are going to be Leo Bloom." Gene, ever skeptical, had doubted him. But when Mel did get the funding, he threw the script on Gene's dressing room table and said, "We got the money. You're Leo Bloom." Gene burst into tears. That moment mirrored the one Mel was now living through. Back then, it was the joy of a dream finally taking shape on Fallon's stage. It was the heartbreak of watching a dreamer disappear. The same man who'd cried with joy when the movie began was now being remembered through tears of loss. And still, even amid sorrow, Mel brought laughter. That's who he is. That's who he's always been. Between heavy breaths, he shared how Gene once asked, "Why are they always laughing at me?" And Mel had replied, "Look in the mirror, blame it on God." But behind that joke was truth. Gene was different. He carried something ineffable. Sincerity wrapped in absurdity, a sadness behind his smile. And Mel, he saw all of it. That Tonight Show interview became a viral moment, not because of fame, but because of its humanity. Here was one of the great comedy architects of all time openly mourning the piece of himself he'd lost. He wasn't hiding behind characters or camera angles or scripts. It was just Mel and the memory of Gene. And it broke him, if only for a few minutes. A silence that, once broken, would reveal just how deeply Gene wanted to protect the man who had made him a star. Why Mel waited until 99. Mel Brooks is not a man known for silence. For over half a century, he's delivered punchlines with surgical precision, spilled truth disguised as comedy, and rarely let a moment pass without putting a spotlight on absurdity. So why did it take him until the age of 99 to open up fully about Gene Wilder, the man who helped define his greatest work and shaped some of his proudest moments? Was it grief timing or something far more personal? The truth is, Mel didn't hold back because he had nothing to say. He held back because he didn't want to say it. Not until now. Not until the decades of laughter had quieted just enough for the pain to rise to the surface. This wasn't about publicity. It wasn't about legacy polishing. It was about time and what time does to the heart. For years after Gene's passing in 2016, Mel offered only glimpses into their friendship. He spoke of the joy they shared, the creativity they unleashed together, and the tenderness behind their larger-than-life personas. But there was always a wall one built of reverence, maybe even guilt. Mel never publicly unpacked the deeper emotions, the complex tangle of love, regret, and what-ifs that often come when someone you cherish dies after drifting quietly into the shadows because Gene drifted by choice. He was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, a disease he kept hidden from the world for years. Even some of his closest friends weren't fully aware of the severity. He didn't want the pity. He didn't want to be remembered for fading. And perhaps that's why Mel didn't talk much about him. Not then. Could it be that Mel felt conflicted, that to share too soon, to dig too deep, would have gone against Gene's wishes for privacy? Mel had always respected Gene as an artist, but more than that, he respected him as a man. And that meant keeping the curtain drawn until he felt it was time to lift it even slightly. In a way, Mel's silence was the greatest act of friendship he could offer. He didn't exploit Gene's illness. He didn't dwell on loss when the world was still freshly mourning. Instead, he waited until nearly a century of living had granted him a voice, not just loud, but earned. Now, at 99, Mel has nothing left to prove. He's a legend many times over. But in speaking about Gene with such raw honesty, breaking down on The Tonight Show, sharing private anecdotes in interviews, and reflecting in recent memoirs, he showed us something more valuable than punchlines: vulnerability. And that vulnerability came with a subtle confession. In one of his rare late-career reflections, Mel admitted, "I still talk to him. Just in my head when something good happens or something bad. I still hear what Gene would say. There's something haunting about that. Mel Brooks, the man who made the world laugh, is still having imaginary conversations with his best friend who's long gone. Not as a coping mechanism, not as a performance, but as a way to keep him near, and maybe just maybe. That's why Mel waited, because grief doesn't follow scripts. And when you lose someone like Gene Wilder, you don't rush to share. You hold it close. You guard the memories until they're ready to come out. Not for applause, but for peace. Now, as Mel approaches the century mark, there's nothing left to hide. He said the things that once made him cry. He shared the laughter behind the tears. And in doing so, he's let us witness the kind of love few friendships ever reach. Mel Brooks and Gene Wilder didn't just make comedies, they made history. Now at 99, Mel has finally led us into the part of that story he kept to himself. The friendship, the pain, and the legacy they built together. It wasn't just about laughs, it was about love, timing, and truth. If this story resonated with you, like, comment, and subscribe for more untold Hollywood moments. And don't miss the next video. It's one you'll want to see.